or so, the jury heard testimony about Hunter's drug use, including from his former girlfriend and brother's widow, Hallie Biden, who recalled throwing the gun at the center of Hunter's case in a trash can in a grocery store near the Hunter Biden's home. He is the president's only surviving son and the first adult child of a sitting U.S. president to face criminal charges. The president has already said he would not pardon his son if he is convicted. I want to go to Laura Jarrett right now as we await the verdict. Laura, this was a pretty straightforward case lasting only 7 days.
That's right, Lester. And the jury only deliberating really roughly 3 hours, just 1 hour yesterday and just a couple hours this morning. We're standing by for our reporters at the courthouse. I believe we do have a verdict from Ryan Nobles there at the courthouse, Lester.
Yeah, let's go to Ryan right now.
Now, the jury here is comprised of...
Yeah, that's right, Lester and Laura. We just received this verdict from our reporters inside the courtroom. On count 1, the verdict is guilty. On count 2, the verdict in the Hunter Biden criminal case is guilty. And on count 3, the verdict is guilty. So on all 3 counts, Hunter Biden, the president's son, is found guilty after about 3 hours of deliberation by this jury. He is the first child of a sitting United States president to be found guilty in a criminal case. This probably does not come as a surprise given the length of time that the jury was deliberating and the volume of evidence that these jurors heard, over 6 days worth of testimony. But the verdict here in Wilmington, Delaware, is Hunter Biden found guilty on all 3 counts in this federal criminal trial. Lester.
And Ryan, I'm going to want to walk through those counts with you in a moment, but I think the question on a lot of minds right now hearing this verdict, what is the potential sentence at stake here?
So over the course of all 3 of these different charges, there are different maximum sentences that Hunter Biden could be sentenced to. In 2 of the charges, there is a maximum sentence of 10 years. In one of the other charges, it is a maximum sentence of 5 years. It is unlikely that he will get the maximum sentence on these 3 counts. The judge will have some discretion in terms of sentencing, and it is very likely that he will receive a much reduced sentence given the fact that he is a first-time offender. It's unclear just how long that sentence may be, or if there's even the possibility that there will be jail time at all. That is certainly under the discretion of the judge. But there are 3 separate counts here. They each have 3 different maximum sentences, 2 of them 10 years, 1 of them 5 years. There's also a question of whether or not they would be served consecutively or concurrently. But the chances that he would serve more than a decade in prison are very unlikely. The judge will have that discretion. And given the fact that he is a first-time offender, that's something that we are still waiting to learn exactly how long he may face in jail, if he faces any time at all.
All right. Ryan Nobles, thank you. Let me go back to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Now, Laura, you've had a moment to digest this. What should we be thinking about? What do we know here?
Lester, it's obviously a devastating blow to Hunter Biden and the Biden family, but it's not entirely unexpected as the evidence here was really challenging for the defense. This all stems from Hunter Biden filling out a form that's used essentially almost as a background check when you're trying to purchase a gun. And when he checked the box that said he was not addicted to a controlled substance or not an unlawful user, the government said that that was a lie, Lester, because he was using drugs at the time. And there was a mountain of evidence that came in at trial that he was addicted to crack cocaine. They used his own words. They used text messages. They used his book, audio recordings from him reading from his book, talking about his lengthy history and struggles with abuse over a number of years. The defense had tried to say the government doesn't have any evidence that he actually used drugs on the day that he actually purchased the gun. So how could they prove it? But the government came along and said, look, we don't have to show that he was using the drugs on that very day. All we have to show is that they were using it around that time, and there was plenty of evidence on that score. And clearly on this point, the jury there agreed, Lester, given how quickly they came back with this verdict. Remember, all of this may never have happened if their plea deal had gone forward, but that was sort of scrapped weeks ago, really months ago, after it fell apart under a judge's scrutiny. And so now he is facing potentially a prison sentence. It's going to be entirely up to the judge, as Ryan laid out there. The maximum sentence here, Lester, is 10 years. But the judge could do something far short of that, given that he doesn't have a criminal record, he doesn't have a criminal history. She could do something far less than that, even probation perhaps. But again, all of this would have gone away completely with no jail time if that plea deal had not fallen apart, Lester.
All right, Laura, thank you. I'll ask you to stand by as well as we bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savala. So, Danny, what are Hunter Biden's options at this point?
At this point, they wait for the sentencing date, which is generally 3 to 4 months out from the conviction. And he'll meet with his probation officer as they prepare the pre-sentence report and start moving towards sentencing, which is generally relatively a short period of time. It can get extended. But from there, after that sentencing date, that is when they file their notice of appeal and start beginning the appellate process, which they undoubtedly will do. But the next steps in this case are proceed to sentencing and argue for a probation-only sentence, which, as Laura pointed out, is a possibility. The sentencing guidelines, roughly calculated, are around 15 to 21 months. But for over a decade now, the United States sentencing guidelines are not mandatory. The judge will calculate them at the sentencing, but ultimately the judge can deviate from them and go below the guidelines, which is likely, although most judges, to ensure that their sentence will not be appealed, will usually stay within the guidelines. A probation-only sentence is a possibility.
All right, Danny, thank you. I want to go back to Ryan Nobles outside the courthouse. Ryan, throughout this trial, we've seen appearances by First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. Is she at the courthouse today?
As a matter of fact, she is, Lester. She just arrived back here at the courthouse just shortly after the verdict was read, so she was not in the courtroom when her son learned his fate. But you are absolutely right. She's been in the courtroom all but one day of this trial. She sat through a lengthy period of jury selection, listening to the jurors being questioned about possibly sitting on this panel. She sat through much of the very grueling, embarrassing, and sometimes heartbreaking testimony from the people that are close associates of Hunter Biden, his former romantic partners, his ex-wife, his ex-girlfriend, Hallie Biden, who is, of course, the widow of Beau Biden, their late son, who was also a romantic partner of Hunter Biden. Jill Biden was there for most of this and listened to that testimony and was there to support Hunter Biden, often embracing him, giving him a kiss as he would either leave or walk into the courtroom. And it's also important to point out that this came at a busy time for the First family. She actually left Wilmington and flew to France to be there for the anniversary of D-Day, was here in Wilmington for just one day, and then flew back to France for the weekend for the official state visit that her husband, President Joe Biden, was a part of before flying back here to Wilmington to be with Hunter Biden again for this verdict to be read. So she's had a very prominent spot in the courtroom, sitting in the first row every single day. She was sitting at one point with Peter Neal, who is, of course, the husband of Naomi Biden, her granddaughter, who had a very tearful and very powerful testimony as well. And it's also important to point out that that's not something the prosecution ignored. During his closing argument, Leo Wise, the federal prosecutor, part of the federal prosecution team, made note of the fact that there were a number of prominent people in the gallery supporting Hunter Biden, but also making sure the jury understood that they should not be part of their deliberations, that no one is above the law, was the point that Leo Wise made, despite the fact that Joe Biden was in that room every single day. And in addition to Jill Biden, we saw James Biden, who's, of course, the president's brother, Valerie Biden Owens, who is the president's sister, many of them in this courtroom on a day-to-day basis there to support Hunter Biden throughout this period of time and over the course of this trial. And one other point I want to make, Lester, as we're learning more information as it comes out of the courtroom, is at this point, the judge has not set a sentencing date. That's something that will be set at a later time. So we don't right now know the time frame by which Hunter Biden will learn his fate in terms of sentencing as it relates to this case. Lester.
All right, Ryan, thanks. Let's get the view now from the White House. Senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez is standing by. Gabe, do we expect to hear from the president? We understand he did not want to put his thumb on the scale during the trial, but now that there is a verdict, will he likely speak?
Hi there, Lester. Well, so far, there's no immediate response from the White House or the Biden campaign just yet. But if we do hear from the president shortly, we expect it to be potentially similar to the statement that he gave at the beginning of this trial. And you remember, the president has been very reluctant to weigh in on this case, which, as you said, reluctant to tip the scales here. But at the beginning of this trial, he gave a very heartfelt statement talking about how he's also a dad and that Jill and I love our son. He also brought up that a lot of families have loved ones across the country who have overcome addiction. So it's possible we may hear some type of that sentiment from the president. Lester, it is a bit ironic. In several hours, the president, who is here in Washington, is set to give remarks at a gun safety conference here in D.C. This, of course, as his son has now been convicted of lying on a gun background check form. But as Ryan alluded to, this has been a very difficult time for the Biden family, with Dr. Jill Biden going to and from France and being in the courtroom virtually every day. The president is expected to leave to the G7 summit tomorrow in Italy. But again, we are awaiting comment right now from the White House. We don't have one just yet, Lester.
All right, Gabe, thank you for that. For more on the politics of all this, let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. Hallie, since the day that Hunter Biden was indicted, this has been an ongoing question of, is this going to be political baggage weighing down on the president's campaign? What's the view right now?
Well, even now, Lester, that is still somewhat of an open question, only because there is just not a lot of polling recently that tells us how voters are feeling about what has happened to Hunter Biden. And obviously, since this guilty verdict came in just the last couple of minutes, we don't have it yet. Here's what I can tell you about the broader political landscape here, that overall numbers over the course of the last 6-8 months or so prior to this trial beginning suggested that the majority of voters felt that Hunter Biden was being treated fairly by the justice system. And frankly, not many of them felt like this would change their position. The ones who did, that fell almost entirely along partisan lines. So it seems unlikely, at least at this point, based on the information we have, that this could move the needle much with persuadable voters. That said, in one survey, about 2% of Democrats suggested that perhaps if Hunter Biden were to be convicted, that could sway them one way or the other, or sway them away from President Biden. Tiny slice of the electorate. This is going to be a close election. But again, we've got to, I think, hit the brakes a bit on that piece of it, because we just don't know how this will play out more broadly, how many people are paying attention here to what's happening. If you look at the way that this could impact the campaign from the president's perspective, you heard Gabe Gutierrez there from the White House North Lawn talk about it. This has been a searingly gut-wrenching trial in many ways for the Biden family. You think about those moments when you had Hunter Biden's daughter on the stand recounting very difficult moments with her father, Hunter Biden himself nearly in tears. Remember that the prosecution acknowledged this, calling much of the evidence that was laid out in this case personal and ugly, but calling that absolutely necessary, and describing to the jury how everything that brought Hunter Biden to this point were his choices and his alone. The jury, obviously today, with this guilty verdict, with this conviction, bought the prosecution's argument, essentially, as Hunter Biden is now convicted. Lester, keep in mind that while we don't know his sentencing date, we do know that this is not the last collision between Hunter Biden's legal issues and his father's political campaign here, because remember what happens in September. That is the date, at least for now, of Hunter Biden's next criminal trial on those felony tax charges for, as the prosecution lays out in that instance, spending his money on everything but taxes, essentially, on drugs, on illicit sex partners, et cetera. So this is not going to be the last time that we will see Hunter Biden or hear about some of his behaviors and some of his actions, Lester.
All right, Hallie, I want to pick up with that as I bring back senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett. Laura, what about other legal exposure that Hunter Biden is facing?
Lester, that's always been the question, whether those tax charges are the end of the road or there's even more. Remember, if the plea deal had gone through, he would have pled guilty to some of those tax misdemeanors, and then that would have been the end of the story. But now there could be other charges that they could add on top of this, and it's just hard to know exactly how big his exposure is. We do know, though, as Hallie mentioned, he's going to go to trial in September on 9 counts, including tax evasion and essentially spending his money on all kinds of other things. but his taxes, according to the government. Now, the defense would push back and say he eventually repaid all of that, so no harm, no foul. But of course, that's not how the law works. And now that we see this guilty verdict, it'd be interesting to see whether his legal advice is that he needs to plead guilty to those charges to avoid yet another conviction from a jury in that case. He obviously has the option now to plead guilty to the tax charges in September. I'm not suggesting that he will. I'm just saying that's now on the table, and it may be a consideration given how this case turned out. In some ways, the tax charge is more serious, Lester, and certainly the facts quite damning. A lot of evidence there, more text messages, more evidence, all sort of part of this long period of anguish and struggles. Again, his mental health struggles, the addiction, the abuse will be part of that as well. But there will be a lot more embarrassing evidence about all the things he was spending money on instead of his taxes, Lester.
All right. Thank you, Laura. For more, let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. How complicated a case was this against Hunter, or was it not complicated at all?
I don't think it was complex at all, Lester. I think it was pretty straightforward. In this particular case, there was only 3 charges. And in those 3 charges, really the prosecution just had to show, one, that Biden was lying to a federally licensed gun dealer, right? That was when he filled out the form. 2, that he was making a false claim on the federal firearms application, again, the same set of facts, and that he possessed an illegally obtained gun for a certain period of time in October of 2018. Again, the same conduct. So even though there were 3 charges, all of it surrounded the same episodic criminal act, which was lying on a federal form to obtain a gun. And really the prosecution just had to show, 1, that he was lying, but then 2, the addiction. And I think that's where it became a little bit difficult, because with addiction, you can't really show that someone was actively using unless you ask that person when they get on the stand. And we know that most defendants don't take the stand. And we know in this case, Hunter Biden did not take the stand. So they weren't able to ask him directly, but certainly all of the evidence that they put on, all of the family members that they put on certainly showed that beyond a reasonable doubt, obviously, as the jury stated.
All right, Kristen, thanks very much. Let's go back to Ryan Nobles outside the courthouse. Obviously, we couldn't see. This is a live picture, actually, we're looking at right now. I believe I saw with Dr. Jill, the
yes,
First Lady. They're
live.
getting in the vehicle right now. As we look at this, Ryan Nobles, what are we hearing from inside the courtroom? I know things have been delayed by the fact we can't have cameras in there. What are we hearing about the reaction?
Yeah, first of all, Lester, you are correct. That is a live picture of Hunter Biden leaving the courthouse today. We're told by our teams that were inside witnessing the verdict being read that Hunter Biden really had no visible reaction as the verdict was read. But it's also important to point out, as you and I talked about earlier, about how much support he had in the courtroom over the course of this more than week-long trial. When the verdict was read, hardly any of his family members were inside the court. The verdict came so quickly, and many of them were not here when it was read, that many of them were not able to react to it until well after the verdict was read. In fact, our colleague Mike Memoli was entering the courtroom at around the time the verdict was read. He saw First Lady Jill Biden outside the courtroom. She actually went into a holding room after the verdict was already read, where Hunter Biden was. So she was not physically in the courtroom when the verdict was read. And then there were other members of the Biden family that were waiting at an elevator to go up into the courtroom to be there to support Hunter when they crossed paths with reporters that were tearing outside of the courthouse to relay the information that the guilty verdict had already been handed down. So it just shows just how quickly this whole process played itself out. The jury got the case yesterday afternoon at around 3:30. They deliberated for less than an hour, went home for the night, reconvened this morning a little after 9. And basically only took about 3 hours to come to the consensus that this was guilty on all 3 counts. And that meant all 12 jurors unanimously agreeing that Hunter Biden was guilty. So that's just a little bit of the flavor here in the courthouse. You know, it's not difficult to get in and out, or I should say it is a bit difficult to get in and out of the courthouse. Even though it is a public courthouse, you have to go through a series of metal detectors. You have to show identification. You're not allowed to bring in any sort of electronic device. So it does take time to get into the courtroom. this whole process played out so quickly that for the most part, it was just Hunter Biden and his legal team in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Lester.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, we were watching these pictures again. This is recorded just a few minutes ago of Hunter Biden, Dr. Jill Biden going out to their motorcade, and they have now left that courthouse area. Let me bring back Gabe Gutierrez is at the White House. Gabe, we know that it's been an issue as to whether the president will speak or not. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that's right, Lester. We don't have any indication whether the president will speak specifically to this verdict, but President Biden is scheduled to speak early this afternoon at a summit, a gun safety summit here in Washington, Everytown for Gun Safety, Gun Sense University, where the White House is expected to tout what it has done over the last several years to combat gun violence, specifically this 2022 bipartisan legislation. And this comes on the heels, the White House says, that yesterday new crime data was released, FBI crime statistics that suggest that crime is down. Of course, this is all part of a broader push as the 2024 elections are just a few months away, where Democrats have been trying to combat a narrative that crime is rising. But again, this all comes at a very odd time, Lester. The president set to give this speech on gun safety while his son has just been convicted of lying on a background check form. But as Hallie was mentioning earlier, this comes, Lester, after just a very difficult past few months where the Biden family has been listening to these charges. And over the last several days, Dr. Joe Biden and other supporters at that trial. Now, Lester, in an interview last year, President Biden said that he believed that his son Hunter had done nothing wrong. But other than that, he has been very reluctant to weigh in on this case. And in an interview last week, saying that he would accept the results of this case, no matter what they were, and also committing to ruling out a pardon for his son Hunter. But again, we do not have an immediate response just yet from the White House or the Biden campaign. We are expecting, though, to hear from the president early this afternoon at that gun safety conference, Lester.
All right, Gabe, I know you'll continue to monitor whatever's happening there at the White House. Thank you. Let me bring back Danny Savalos. Danny, it was a very short deliberation. What are we reading to that?
It was short in some ways, at least compared to more complex cases like white-collar type cases, tax cases. But generally speaking, juries are not out as long as the popular conception is of juries staying out for 2 or 3 days at a time. That doesn't really happen that often. And the issues in this case were simple enough for the jury to wrap their heads around. Yes, there were complexities in terms of defining what addiction is, but the jurors were given jury instructions that defined these concepts. Now, the defense had a really difficult challenge here. One of their themes was that there's lots of evidence of drug use, but not necessarily evidence of drug use on these particular days. The problem for the defense was that the jury instructions covered this situation. They said in so many words that the government doesn't have to prove that Hunter Biden used drugs at the precise time that he held the firearm. And as to possession, the government didn't need to prove possession at an exact moment. Possession can be fleeting. It can be momentary. So these jury instructions demonstrate why the defense really had a challenge and why the government, by putting on so much evidence of drug use, allowed the jury to draw an inference and to draw that inference relatively quickly.
All right, let's go back to Ryan Nobles and bring in NBC's Sarah Fitzpatrick. She's been covering the trial from the beginning and was inside the courtroom when the verdict was read. Sarah, what was it like in there?
Your wireless IP.
Sarah doesn't have her earpiece in quite yet. So, Sarah, Lester just asked you what it was like inside the courtroom as the verdict was read.
It was quiet. As soon as the judge walked in and the jury walked in, everyone kind of jumped to attention, and it all happened very quickly. Hunter Biden sat at the table, eyes focused on the jury. He sat with his hands folded, and the foreperson read the verdict, and it went very quickly. Guilty, guilty, guilty. And after that, he turned around and hugged the associates, the law associates that were sitting directly behind him. He hugged his attorney, Abby Lowell, as well as David Kalansky, another attorney on the case. And then after the judge asked if there was any additional business, both his attorney and the prosecutors said no, and he walked out. He walked into the aisle where he kissed his wife, Melissa, on the lips, and then slowly the kind of Biden supporters, in silence, essentially, walked out into the aisle and into the hallway of the courtroom, where they then went into the defense room. I was sitting outside watching in the hallway for several minutes while Hunter Biden and his closest supporters kind of stayed in that room. He walked out. You could kind of hear the door open, and Hunter Biden walked out and said, "Ready? Okay, everybody, let's go." He walked out holding his wife's hand, and directly behind him was the First Lady with sunglasses on, looking down at the floor. Hunter ensured that the First Lady got into the elevator, and they got into the elevator. He exited with a slight smile, and that was it. And then suddenly the hallways were quiet. We saw the jury walk out through a separate hallway secured by the U.S. Marshals. One at a time, they kind of passed through our vision, all looking directly at the press that was left behind. And then that was it. Clerks started closing doors and kind of preparing files to be carried out, and that was all. I saw some supporters kind of in the hallways supporters of the Biden family that had been there for the entire trial. They, had tears in their eyes, some of them arms folded, just a feeling of kind of, I don't know how to describe it. They're just silence was all we heard primarily.
Well, a very vivid account. I understand you can hear us now. I'll ask both of you, Ryan, we're hearing what sounds like protests in the background. Has there been a lot of public reaction to this?
Yeah, Lester, I wouldn't make too much about this small smattering of protesters that are out here today. That gentleman you can see in the yellow reflective vest has been out here almost every morning, basically taunting those of us in the press for our coverage, and also taunting the Biden family as they come in and out every day, kind of just repeating Republican talking points, really, as it relates to the Biden family in general and Hunter Biden specifically. But we have not seen the same kind of demonstrations that we've seen around similar court cases involving the former president, either for or against. There are a bevy of supporters here, encouraging Hunter Biden as he comes in every day. And at the same time, there is not a large group of people out here also protesting it. It's basically the same 2 or 3 protesters who have been here every day, kind of yelling out the same similar message. But there doesn't appear to be an overwhelming groundswell of anger or support on either side of this case.
All right. Sir, do we expect to hear from the special counsel? Are there any press conferences that have been scheduled that you're aware of?
So I was with both prosecutors as they walked out of the courtroom. They said that they had no comment and that we would hear shortly if they planned to do a press conference. It seemed like that decision had not yet been made. I think if we do have a press conference, we should expect that it will be very short, because the parties have indicated, the defense has indicated that they plan to appeal this case. And so I think any comments will be relatively short, relatively straightforward. The special counsel's office has maintained, a very strict. They have tried to purely keep this case in the courtroom, and so I think we will hear them thank the jury, but that will be about it.
And Lester, just to add, our team's telling us that they have rolled a podium out here outside the courthouse, which the expectation would be that we'd get some sort of statement from the special counsel. But no one's formally notified us that is going to happen or what time that will happen. But that is one thing to keep in mind. And Lester, we are also getting response for some Republicans who have obviously been insistent that Hunter Biden be prosecuted for a wide range of what they believe to be crimes. But in this case specifically, James Comer, who's the chair of the House Oversight Committee, he's one of the lead investigators in the impeachment inquiry. We should point out that the impeachment inquiry is actually into the president. It is largely fizzled out. They've not been able to find any direct evidence between Hunter Biden's activities that would relate directly to the president itself. But they've also offered up criminal referrals on behalf of Hunter Biden and James Biden to the Department of Justice for crimes that they believe should be investigated. And James Comer's just put out this statement saying that Hunter Biden's sweetheart deal was smoked out after scrutiny by a federal judge. Today's verdict is a step towards accountability. But until the Department of Justice investigates everyone involved in the Biden's corrupt influence peddling, this is obviously James Comer's words, not mine, that generated over $18 million in foreign payments to the Biden family, it will be clear department officials will continue to cover for Joe Biden. And, you know, it's important to point out, Lester, when we talked about how the plea arrangement that initially would have avoided all of this for Hunter Biden, one of the reasons that plea arrangement fell apart was because the judge, and it's the same judge that presided over this case, was concerned because there seemed to be a difference of opinion between the prosecutors and the defense team as to whether or not that plea agreement would mean that their investigation was over, that they wouldn't be looking in to any of these accusations of foreign influence peddling by Hunter Biden and by extension the Biden family. And they left open that option, that investigation would continue. Despite the fact that they've made it clear that investigation is not closed out, the Justice Department did move, I should say the special counsel's office specifically did move on this particular case, which has now led to a guilty verdict. And they've also moved on a case involving tax evasion and Hunter Biden, that case scheduled to go to trial in September. They've made no movement on any of the foreign influence peddling accusations that have arisen. So it's not as if those investigations have not continued. It's not as if they haven't looked into it. They just have not at least gotten to the point quite yet where they believe there's enough evidence to move toward an indictment.
All right, Ryan, thanks. Let's go back to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. Laura, obviously these are important and serious charges, but would they typically, do we know if they would be typically form a case that goes to trial absent any other crimes?
No, Lester, and that's what's made this case curious for so long as it has gone on, is that the actual filling out the form, which is the false statement that he was charged with, is almost never charged. In fact, former federal prosecutors that I've talked to said in their entire career they've never seen a case on this alone go to trial. It might be looped in with some other charges. If you think about large scale gun and drug cases, it might be one of, a mountain of other charges, but you've never ever see this just as a standalone charge. And I think it's what led to a lot of questions about the special counsel's decision to do this case. It's one of the things you've heard the defense talk about a lot, is what changed? Why did this case suddenly become a federal case after not for so long? Remember, the investigation into the president's son dates back years, really to 2018, far before the president became the president. He was being investigated under the Trump administration, and they essentially sat on it for a long time and didn't charge him, and then only did, as Ryan mentioned, after that plea deal fell apart. And so obviously the special counsel, David Weiss, has come under scrutiny from Republicans who think he hasn't done enough to be tough on Hunter. He's come under scrutiny from liberals and progressives who think he's gone after Hunter for something that no one else would have been charged with. And so he's come under a fair amount of scrutiny and criticism. And I should mention the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has pushed back in an op-ed today very strongly, Lester, against those who have attacked the department and have attacked the career prosecutors at that department, saying that the conspiracy theories and all the falsehoods are absurd and that they're putting the Justice Department staff at risk. It'll be interesting to see what the special counsel David Weiss says about this, I assume, when he gives that press conference in the coming minutes, Lester. And
just to turn it on its head, the idea of what some have called the sweetheart deal, the plea deal, was that in itself rare given how it was laid out?
No, those happen all the time, all across America. People are pleading guilty and having plea deals. What was noteworthy about it is the fact that there was not apparently a meeting of the minds between the prosecution and the defense. And as Ryan explained, it was only under questioning by the judge who said, wait a minute, do you understand exactly what this is covering and what it doesn't cover? That it was clear that Hunter thought he was going to essentially have full immunity and full protection from anything down the line. And the special counsel's office did not think that that was the case. And that was sort of an odd moment that they weren't on the same page about all of that. Now, it doesn't mean that the special counsel is going to come along and file charges, more serious charges that some members of the GOP have been calling for, some of those foreign influence charges. It doesn't mean that they're ever going to file them, but they weren't willing to rule it out, Lester.
All right, Laura Jarrett, thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more ahead on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCnews.com, and a full wrap-up tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day, everyone, and thank you for watching.